What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of JaAR. JaAR, for those of you that may be new, stands for Joe.
And Amy.
Review. This is our weekly show where we review the magic stories, and this week we are back with the finale, part 3 of 3 of our review of War of the Spark Ravnica by Greg Weisman. Before we get started on this one, I did just want to say this is a whirlwind week for us here at Geek for All. We are filming this on Tuesday. You will see it on Thursday. But yesterday, being Monday, into today, because I did go until like 1:30 in the morning or something ridiculous, we were part of the Corset 2020 preview streamer event on MTG Arena. And we were fortunate, as we have been for the past few sets, to be sponsored once again by Wizards of the Coast. We thank them for that sponsorship, but we want to also thank any and all of you that came out to hang out with us, and if you were not able to get a chance to see it, it's on the channel. It's pretty long, so feel free to jump around, but we were super happy to get our first, and I don't think this is really a spoiler because you should just go watch it because it was an absolute blast, but we got our first 7-win sealed deck ever on MTG Arena during that stream, so that was absolutely great. I won't tell you what was in it. That you'll have to go see for yourself, but that felt really good. We had a lot of fun regardless, so I definitely encourage you to go check that out.
Yes.
Like I said, this is going up on Thursday, which means that it will have also already happened, but if you go to www.twitch.tv/DAM314, that's our good friend Dave. We have been on his stream in the past. I have been on his stream many times. Amy and I have also joined him on stream in the past, and this past Wednesday, so the day before this comes out, I will have been with Dave to be a part of his stream the weekend Wednesday to play more of our playthrough of Spider-Man on the PS4, which is always fun. So I'm definitely looking forward to it. They are Dave's community, the Garnted Cult, that I somewhat helped form, is absolutely some of the best people out there. So you should definitely go check out the VOD in this instance, but then you should hit him with a follow and check out his other streams all the time, whether I'm on it or not, because it is definitely worth your time. He is a good man. So, and last but not least, before we get into the review, I apologize, but this Friday into Saturday, so technically it would be Saturday morning for those of us here on the East Coast at least, we are going, as we do often, to Champion Card Collector in Poughkeepsie, New York, and we are going to be there live for the midnight pre-release for Corset 2020. We are going to get pre-release kits, we are going to open them on camera, we are going to show you all of the cards that we get in those kits, so if you do not have an opportunity to go to at least the midnight pre-release, you will get a chance to see what those kits look like, what some of the cards look like, in paper, in your hand. Maybe we'll see, supposedly the pull rates for foils has gone up, so that's pretty cool.
Okay.
So we will see how that works out for all of us. Plus we can see what cool promos we get and rares and stuff, and see what kind of cool decks could have been made out of the kits that I open on camera. And then we'll be there to see what other people open as well, walking around the store and doing some promotional videos as well as we do, because we absolutely love it. It's an absolute blast, and you should definitely go check that out as well. So, now done with the shameless plugs, we can actually begin.
Oh, the promos are over.
Yes, and we can begin with our conclusion. I think it's somewhat appropriate that we had all that fun stuff going on, because it's like we're closing the book, on War of the Spark. Sorry, it was bad, I know. Closing the book on War of the Spark, and we are going into Corset 2020. So we are finishing our review of the novel of War of the Spark Ravnica. So if you missed the last 2 weeks, I encourage you to go check those out, because we're going to maybe reference back to it, but otherwise we're probably going to skip over a lot of that stuff. So,
or we're going to attempt to. Anyway.
Yes, as best we can without having to reference back.
Because we don't want to be as repetitive as the book.
Or the online stories following the book.
Right.
So, there's no definitive delineation necessarily, but one of the big points with the start of this last third of the book, so to speak, was Vraska's return. She finally shows up 2/3 of the way into this novel, which is somewhat disappointing that she wasn't around for more of it, especially because so many people, I think, gravitated towards the Ixalan and Rivals of Ixalan stories with Vraska and Jace and their interactions with one another, and especially the plan that was put forth for Vraska's memories being returned to her so that she could assist Jace in taking down Nicol Bolas together, and Vraska kind of being able to do it somewhat from the inside. And then this novel and this story in general, it's not necessarily this book, it's the story of War of the Spark, made that no longer necessary.
Right.
Vraska almost certainly, and we haven't gotten into the prequel stories yet, so we'll find out in the prequel stories if this is actually a true statement, but at the end of the novel, I would argue that Vraska's presence in the novel almost wasn't even necessary.
Right.
Like, except when she was part of the group of guildmasters that brought Niv Mizzet Reborn back, or brought Niv Mizzet to be reborn.
But then it could have just been whoever.
Stand-in Golgari Guildmaster number 5.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. She did not really have a continuation of her story, except that there was still a lot of focus on how down on herself she was. And it's like, saying that she deserves it and deserves all the hatred that she was getting and stuff. And it was like, I would really love to know whether that's warranted or whether she's being hard on herself. But we can't know that because the prequel stories didn't come out before the novel. And I'll say this now because we're in the finale, so I can talk about this now. I didn't write it down here either, so... Reading the beginning of this novel and knowing because of how the cards were spoiled prior to the novel coming out as well, which is kind of a necessity, but and they did it in a really cool way. We even went through and did a JaAR on the preview cards as they came out in story form. We did the last day of previews as a JaAR, and I encourage you to check that out as well if you have a chance. But we went through and we did that, and it worked out nicely the way that they did that. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, it means that we knew the big story beats. We knew the big story beats of Liliana and Gideon's sacrifice and all those other things and how Bolas gets taken down, and that when they said he died, we knew that he was in the prison realm, so that was, not as big of a reveal for us, but that's fine. But what it means is, reading the novel from the beginning, I could tell that the novel, it seemed to me, I don't want to say I could tell, in my opinion, it seemed like the novel was being written in such a way as to foreshadow the ending and or benefit you for reading it a second time once you know how it ends.
Yeah.
Which is not a bad thing in and of itself.
I suppose.
I would say because there was such dislike for the novel as a whole, most people will not have the added benefit, or at least what I guess the author would have thought was the added benefit, of reading it the second time and catching all those kind of Easter eggs of like, oh yeah, you're talking about how noble Gideon is, and then at the end he is noble. And obviously that's just scratching the surface. It's obviously much deeper than that. I just didn't write down any examples, but it really did seem like there was a lot of discussion of who Gideon was as a person, and what he would and would never do. And then in the end of the novel, whether he goes against that or plays right into it, you at least get to see that at the end, so that on a second read-through, you may kind of be prompted to be like, oh yeah, okay, we saw that. And again, I don't know, you seem to not think that it was as good, just based on your reaction. Maybe I misinterpreted.
I won't say it was bad, but I do think it was sort of very, I don't know. Like you said, we knew the story beats ahead of time, so it wasn't, I don't know.
Well, and
I don't know. I feel like we knew the story beats ahead of time, and so I feel like a lot of the ways in which they went about actually getting us to those conclusions were not as good as I expected them to be.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and again, I mean, it excuse me, it kind of goes to your point as well of complaining about the repetitiveness of the book as well as the online stories and etc. So if you're someone who bought the novel, read the online stories, read the prequel stories, is going to read the sequel story, why would you want to go back and read the novel a second time?
Right.
Because there are many parts of the novel that you've now heard at minimum twice. I don't know if in the sequel book, War of the Spark Forsaken, if they're going to reiterate beats from the first one, and not necessarily word for word, but like remind you of like, well, when we first met, this happened. You know, Teo and Rat talking to each other, and it's like, yeah, that just happened. We just read that book. So I don't know. I don't know that. We don't have advanced copies of the book, and at the time that we're filming this, the book is not coming out till November. So,
and hey, maybe some of the stuff that was like throwback information, you know, backstory kind of information that was given to us in this novel will be given to us again when we read the prequel stories. And possibly even then also the sequel stories.
Yeah.
So who knows?
Yeah. So
hopefully it's not like that. But.
Right. But it's the idea of just information saturation, and again, it goes to the point that I've been saying in these review videos that I've been assuming, which is that this story seems to have been written for people who are new to the Magic stories.
Right.
Which it would make sense if they're beating the essential information into you by saying it over and over and over and over again, because for new readers or for new people new to the Magic story, they want to make sure that they remember these things,
right,
because it's what either Wizards and or Greg Weisman thinks is important.
Yeah.
But I think my whole point in referencing Vraska originally with this is the prequel stories didn't come out first. So we don't know her motivations or why she is acting the way she's acting.
Yeah.
And I don't want to have to read this novel when it comes out, then read the prequel stories, and then have to go back and read the novel so that so that we better understand what happened in the different points at this novel. It's just silly. Wow. Yeah, I agree, obviously. Yeah, it's unfortunate. It really is. And then the big part of this final third of the novel, besides the resurrection of Niv-Mizzet, which, to be fair, I don't have a ton to say about that. We spoke about it last week with Teo, and I encourage you to go watch that part, because that, I think, is the biggest takeaway I had from that scene, besides that I thought it was kind of interesting. It'll be nice to read the portion of the prequel stories where we see Ral and Niv's original plan fail and Niv dying because of it, and kind of what that turns into. So I'm looking forward to that. But Niv-Mizzet Reborn was cool. I'm looking forward to seeing the next time we return to Ravnica.
At this point, I'm not sure I am looking forward to that.
I'm looking forward to seeing what Niv-Mizzet Reborn does as the Guild Pact, the new Guild Pact. That's intriguing to me.
Okay.
But let's let it be a while, huh? But yeah, the other big main story beat for the end of this novel was the large final battle. Gideon is going towards Bolus. The other Planeswalkers and guild members are filing into the streets to take out the last of these Eternals for one last sweep through. The main portion that I'm basically referring to here is Dak's point of view, where he is talking about, oh, and over there you've got Semut doing this, and over here you've got Karn ripping heads off, Eternals, and here you've got a Johnny tearing through things, and I'm over here with Kaya who's ghosting through, and we hear from Kaya that she's like phased for too long, and it's hard to breathe, and she's barely holding on, but she is holding on, and Teo is using his shield as a battering ram as well as protecting people, and like you get little beats, little things here and there about almost everyone, right? Angrath has his chain and he's whipping it around and telling everybody to back off and killing a bunch of them. That's cool. I like those kinds of moments. I don't know that it was done effectively enough in this novel, because there are a lot of characters, and each character, I feel like, can speak to a different person. Not literally. Like, speak to you on a personal level, right? Like, oh, I identify with Angrath. If you're new to the channel, Amy would say, probably, please correct me, that you would identify with Nissa. You would want to hear what Nissa's doing. You'd want to hear what Nahiri's doing. You'd want to hear, not at all, what Soren's doing, because you don't care.
Oh, no, I care. Because I want to kill him.
I want to know what Ajani's doing. I would love to see what Karn's doing. Teferi, like these, cool, interesting characters that we would love to hear about. And when they only get like a sentence in the battle per planeswalker, especially when you're really like Dak's portion really focused on himself and Karn, and that was kind of it for that one chapter. Which means that anyone who is a fan of any of the other planeswalkers is going to feel cheated out of hearing more about their favorite planeswalker and what they did during the fight. No, you only get a sentence. Sorry, Nissa lovers. Sorry, Arlen Cord lovers. Sorry, Angrath lovers. You get a sentence. Maybe two. And that's it. And for a novel that is called War of the Spark, you would think that the war portion would be the part that would have the most time spent on it. Now, that being said, well, first of all, I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, well, we kind of talked about how not a lot of the characters got characterization because there just wasn't time for it.
I was just going to say that. Yes, that's correct. No, please, that's important. Go for it.
Because too many cooks.
Yes. Yep. It's and
what do you want?
No, and what I wrote in my notes, which is why I wanted to refer back to them. What I just said, what I just advocated for, which is more time with each of these planeswalkers, arguably wouldn't have made sense. Because you knew nothing about them prior.
Right.
Next to nothing about them prior.
Especially if you were that new reader that we keep talking about.
That's my point.
The
exactly.
fact that this book is the person this book is for.
Right. Which is exactly my point. That's the ideal, and that's the kind of scenario that I would enjoy. I mean, again, in War of the Spark, there was the card Commence the End Game, right? I'm like wearing the shirt. I didn't necessarily do it on purpose, but in Avengers Endgame, for those of you that saw it, if you didn't see it, maybe fast forward 10 seconds. I'm not really spoiling a lot, but there was a big battle scene at the end. Surprise, surprise.
Okay.
But it had so many characters. But each and every one of those characters, when they were on screen for however long or short they were on screen, it mattered. But why did it matter? Because you knew about them from either Infinity War or their prior solo or team-up movies prior to that. Because if you haven't seen Infinity War and then you watch Endgame, again, just skip ahead a little bit, I'm sorry. If you haven't seen Infinity War and then you see Endgame, that scene where Peter Quill gets saved by Gamora and walks up to her and goes, "I thought I'd lost you," and touches her face, and she twists his arm back and says, "Don't touch me." Does that mean as much to you? Is that as relevant? Maybe not.
Probably not.
But...
Or you probably go, what?
Right. But if you have the context, it means something to you.
Right.
And so, with that context, you can put the importance of that together. And so that's why I then wrote, it would have been nice to have been able to hear more about the Teferis and the Jayas and the Chandras of the world. I guess Chandra got her own part, but the Jayas, Teferis, like the secondary, tertiary planeswalkers. But would it have mattered? We didn't have any characterization of Teferi really at all in this novel. And so to hear more about what he was doing to a new reader wouldn't have meant a damn thing.
Right.
So...
Well, I mean, it would have made them learn about Teferi.
Would it? It would have made them maybe curious about him, but some of it may have gone, like I said, with the Star-Lord Gamora thing, it may have gone right over their head. and then they just move on because it's like, oh, it's another character name, right? Like, there's just so many named characters. Like, you're like, oh, okay, Teferi did that. That's cool. Who's Teferi again? Doesn't matter.
Well,
We're on
and
to the next
that's why
one.
it made more sense for them to focus on Teo, because he was a new character anyway.
And arguably the stand-in for the audience.
Right. And it would have made more sense for them to incorporate Rat a bit more, but
Well,
they didn't. They did that in the online stories, which is
Did they though?
debatably fine.
I was going to, did they though?
They attempted to.
Okay, so with that being said, this is the final fight scene of all of them distracting Bolus, just killing the Eternals while Gideon gets to Bolus, because that's the most important thing. But in that, obviously we all know Gideon was going to Bolus, going to his death. But there was another character who we knew had to die as well, who wasn't dead yet. And that was Dak Fate. Because I guess they needed another meaningful death besides Gideon's to make this feel like enough. So again, I will reference Endgame one more time, and it is, I will not give specifics, because I would hate that if someone did it to me. Again, maybe just skip 10 seconds. 3 deaths in Endgame. Or, sorry, 3 endings of stories in Endgame. I will not specify whom, just in case, but 3 endings in Endgame. 3 endings in this novel. Domri, less relevant earlier on. Whether that's a good thing or not,
Right.
because there are Domri fans out there.
There are a lot of them, in fact.
Wait, you like Gruel?
I do like Rule. I'm not a huge fan of Domri.
Well, congrats, I
but
guess.
It is congrats, because I'm sure there were plenty of people who were upset about how that all went.
Right. So, Domri goes early, and it feels like it was meant to be somewhat more impactful because he was the first, and that is how you're introduced to the fact that sparks are going to be harvested. But it's not as impactful if you know the fact that sparks are going to be harvested by looking at cards like, I don't know, Spark Harvest, which literally has Domri on it with his spark being harvested. So it's not a big reveal if you know the cards first. And again, it makes sense that the cards have to be previewed first, but at the same time it kind of doesn't, right? I don't know that I would have hated having the prequel stories come out during Guilds of Ravnica and Ravnica Allegiance, and then the novel come out towards the tail end of Ravnica Allegiance so that you could read the novel, know the story beats, and then see them visually depicted on cards. Would that have been a bad thing? I feel like that would have been better. So that then you could have been surprised by what was going on in the novel, as opposed to knowing all of the big story beats besides one part at the end that was actually intriguing to me and a bit of a surprise, as opposed to everything else, which was not. It was not a surprise. I just wanted to see how they got there.
I mean, I've been saying that from day one. I've been saying that all this time, that they never should show us the cards before telling us the story. They should tell us the story first and then show us all the cards, because at that point, then we can look at the cards and go, oh, okay, I remember the portion of the story that corresponds with. And instead of seeing all the cards and then being like, I wonder what's happening here. Oh, I wonder what's happening here. Oh, it's obvious what's happening here.
Right.
And so then when the story comes out, you already know it.
And especially because reading a story beat doesn't automatically spoil what cards are going to be printed around that story beat. It doesn't automatically tell you what abilities are going to be on planeswalkers from the set because of the story, but vice versa does.
Right.
If you're looking at the cards, you're like, let's say tomorrow Jace comes out with, a Jace card gets previewed for whatever the fall set is, and he is doing stuff with artifacts. It's like, wow, okay, I guess in the story he's like a tech guy now, and obviously that's not going to happen. I'm just throwing a thing out there as an example. But you would kind of have the idea of like, oh, okay, I guess in the stories he's doing something with tech now, so that then the first time in the stories he picks up something tech related and starts tinkering with it, it's not really a surprise to you. I mean, you might go, oh, okay, here's where it is, right? But it wouldn't be as much of a surprise to you, whereas if it came out in the book first and you're like, what is Jace doing with all this technology? Is that going to show up on his card? Are we going to get artifacts that relate to the Jace Planeswalker card now? Are we even going to get a Jace Planeswalker card? You could kind of read the story and try to guess based on the story beats which Planeswalkers are getting cards based on who is the most focused on in the set.
Yeah. And instead of doing that stuff that we had talked about in previous JaARs, where it literally seemed like they were just grasping at straws to come up with any way to try and make people spend more money or be more invested in the stories, that's the way to do that.
Yeah,
by
build the
giving
intrigue.
the preview cards after the story beat that it refers to has already been released.
Mm-hmm.
That's a way to get people invested in the story, because right now all they're invested in is seeing those previews, and the reason is because that's the first time they see what happens in the story.
Yeah.
That's not the way it has to go. You guys, you can release the story first and then release those cards. That's how people will get invested in the stories again.
Yeah.
And not branching out into 50 zillion different types of media that just confuse everyone in terms of what we have to do. I mean, that subscribe to the newsletter thing as being a way to get the story? Why? That makes no sense.
Well, and it's somewhat obvious, and
unless you want that to be the only way that people can get stories, you know, pick a lane and stay in it.
And I think we're moving a bit away from reviewing the novel, but I will say one last thing on it, which is that if you think we're confused by going over here for the prequel stories, and here's a novel, and here's a comic book, and here's the online stories that we're still holding on to, even though it seems kind of clear to me that they want to move away from that because it's not doing anything for them. If you think we're confused, look at their release dates for all of those things. Yeah. They are much more confused than we are.
And how sad is that?
I mean, it's not, at this point, it's not sad, it's their own faults. That's not sad at all.
Well,
you dug this
still
grave.
Sad.
No, it's not. I don't feel any remorse for them at all.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's pathetic.
Yes, that's fair.
It's very pathetic.
That's fair.
And, if the company can't even get it straight, how are we supposed to?
Well, clearly we're not, because they aren't even... We're going way off topic. They aren't even taking the time to explain it to us because they can't.
Yeah.
They don't have an explanation for it, which is why they're not doing it. Excuse me. They can't justify it.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's not being justified. They're just putting them out and going, well, here they are. And we're going, wait, what? Is this the prequel? These are the sequel? When are they coming out? You didn't even have a release date for the start of the prequel stories being sent to us through email. At least now they're telling us when the novel's available, but that's because you actually have to pay for that, and you have to know when you're getting shipped the thing that you paid for.
Right.
That may be the only reason why. When's the next time we're getting online stories? Do you know? Because I don't. To be fair, we don't even know what the fall set is. Usually we know that by now. The core set 2020 is coming out. On the back of the tokens, there is usually an advertisement for the fall set, or for the next set, on the back of tokens from each new set.
Yeah.
So, does that mean that there are people out there who already know the name for the fall set? Because I know people have already gotten their hands on core set 2020. So, do people already know, or is that just not on the back of tokens? That's also possible. So, bringing it back. As I mentioned, we had Gideon's death, which was coming, and we knew it was coming. But there was another death that we knew was coming if we had watched that awesome trailer, which you saw on the YouTube channel, you probably saw on Reddit, you saw on MTG Arena, it was all over the place. And it was very good, to be completely fair. It was a very good trailer. There were a bunch of channels that got trailer reactions, where they got to see the trailer, film their reaction to it the first time, and make a video on it, which, hi, we do a review show too. Anyway, just, you know, a little softball there.
But anyway, I mean, the trailer gave away a lot too.
Well, but that was my point. In the trailer, there's a death as well, in Dak Faden. Which, Dak Faden's inclusion in the novel, if you didn't know that he was dying, would have felt very weird. Because what in the world does Dak Faden have to do with anything that's going on in this novel?
Kind of nothing.
More so than any other planeswalker in this novel, besides like Teo, right? Because Teo was the new addition, but he's the audience stand-in. He's the planeswalker who just sparked, so we get to see his journey from the beginning, which makes perfect sense. But why Dak Faden? Why not focus on Angrath? Why not focus on Samut? Why not focus on Watley? Well, because later on in this novel, Dak has to die. So we have to hear from Dak in these individual chapters on the lead-up so that it's more impactful when he dies at the end, or towards the end. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because I would argue that it wasn't super impactful.
Right.
Gideon's death, I thought, was written rather well. I felt emotional during the reading of Gideon's death. I knew it was coming. It wasn't a surprise. Same with Dak Faden's. But, same with Domri's. But I still felt emotion because they had given Gideon the full closing of then going and seeing his irregulars and the relationship that he had with them, the heartwarming redemption part of the novel. I appreciated that. And obviously Gideon is the larger character in comparison to Dak Faden in terms of the story that they're trying to tell. But they devoted multiple chapters to Dak Faden's portion of this story, because they wanted his death to be impactful towards the end, and I felt personally that it fell short. I don't know if you agree, if you want to expound on it.
I don't really want to talk about Gideon's death.
Okay. Well, too bad, because now what you're talking about is the only other thing left to talk about before we do our wrap-up. And for those of you that have been paying attention, there's a topic that we had said earlier, or Amy had said earlier, that she would focus on later. Well, this is the finale, so it's later.
It's later.
Amy, would you tell us your thoughts on, yes, Gideon's death, but how Gideon died, what he did, and who it was for?
The fact that Liliana gets a redemption of any kind, in my opinion, is an insult to every single one of the readers who, myself included, is an abuse victim. Period. Abusers do not, cannot be better people. Abusers are abusers. The end. And when abuse victims learn that, get past that, figure out how to accept that, forgive ourselves for having that happen to us, and move on with our lives, This is not what we should be given. The attaboy that we should be given is Liliana dying.
Okay, so let me ask you a question if you don't mind. Not necessarily saying agree, disagree, I'm just curious. Liliana dying. Liliana dying because she deserves it, because of who she is and what she did to the Gatewatch as a whole, but obviously much, much, much more specifically Jace. Or dying and like giving of herself and dying because it's the right thing to do because of what she put them all through. I don't even know if I'm necessarily
No.
saying this correctly, but
No. An abuser does not give of themselves. An abuser only does things for themselves.
right. Or only takes, doesn't give. Okay.
It is an insult that this is part of this story. It is irresponsible for the storytellers to decide to give us this story, especially when they're trying to get younger readers or younger kids into magic. You cannot think that you're doing a positive thing by spreading a message that an abuse victim can continue to give of themselves to an abuser and have that be beneficial. It's irresponsible to give that message because it's untrue. An abuse victim can do that until it literally kills them. And that abuser will never have a change of heart. That's not how it works. It's a fantasy story, I understand, but when all the stories leading up to it are going to be that hard-hitting and that realistic, you can't just finish it off with a pretty little bow just because you want it to have a pretty little bow. If you're gonna include the grit, make sure that the end makes sense, instead of being a slap in the face to those of us who have done this. Those of us who are Gideon in that situation. We literally kill ourselves for that person. And in reality, that person does not care. That person does not decide that they've made the wrong choice and that now they want to do the right thing. That's not how it goes. So, yes, in my opinion, it's extremely irresponsible for you to just be yet another one of these stories that we get bombarded with in our society, that the victim should remain the victim and the abuser gets to remain the abuser because they're actually a good person. No, they're not. They're not.
And it leads me to the main point of my wrap-up, which is really just a way to come full circle, but also to hammer a point home. this story, and it bothers me a lot that I don't know whether I should be looking to Greg Weisman or whether I should be looking to the story liaisons at Wizards of the Coast. But this story dropped ball after ball after ball of characterization. Not just because they didn't better characterize some of the other planeswalkers, but because they did incorrectly characterize a lot of their main storyline planeswalkers.
Yes.
They screwed up the Vraska story, the Vraska Jace story, massively. Massively. And I'm looking...
They basically just retconned the whole thing.
And again, the previous stories have not been looked at yet, so maybe they turn it around, because from what I've heard at least, Django Wexler has been doing a good job with the stories. But in terms of continuity, it feels very rough that a large portion of your story, one of your story spotlights, or two, from Rivals of Ixalan, focused on the Jace and Vraska plan, and then later on it seems like later on, after that entire story team was let go or transferred to a different portion of the company, that they decided to go in a completely different direction and go with this Gideon Liliana arc, which seemed to start in Amonkhet, or at the tail end. I guess it was a bit in Amonkhet, but not really, but more so, much, much more so, in Dominaria, is where it really started. Which, again, is right at the beginning of when the new authors came in, or the contract authors came in, and that's when the Gideon Liliana arc began, and then ends here at War of the Spark, whereas the Vraska Jace arc, which you tell me, but I think is a much more positive relationship that an abuse victim obtains.
Yeah.
In Vraska meeting Jace, the amnesiac Jace, but then when he regains his memories, even then he is much more understanding and continues their friendship / romance, and gets that awesome moment of Vraska explaining her past and Jace doing what we said at the time was the exact right thing in saying, thank you for sharing that with me.
Yeah.
Not saying, I can fix it, it's going to be okay, don't worry about it, you're being too dramatic, or that sounds awful, it must have been terrible, I know how you feel. Nope. He said, thank you for sharing that with me. And she, in this novel, they had them kissing, and sure, great. Because they met back up, and Bolas is gone.
Hands and all that. She doesn't even like to be touched.
She kind of grew to be okay with Jace's touch, but only kind of. But then she got all her memories back from someone who, again, as I mentioned previously, wouldn't have known that she was missing those memories, because Jace got rid of them so that Nicol Bolas, the greatest telepath in the multiverse, wouldn't know that she was missing those memories. So I don't know what godlike character randomly is on Ravnica to give Vraska her memories back, but they wouldn't have known that they were gone, so we'll see how that goes. But
and she wouldn't have known they were gone either.
Precisely.
She wouldn't have remembered.
Right, because when Jace took them away, he hid, and she gave the Immortal Sun to Bolas, like, as if she were continuing her mission and finishing it, really, and then taking over the Golgari for it. So I think that the characterization was so bad, but the reason that I say that I don't know whether it's Greg Weisman or the story team is because the problem that you have with these contract authors is you cannot give them enough of the reading to do where they will know enough about these characters to understand all of their motivations, all of their little quirks and etc. And apparently not even enough to know their massive
just
personality traits. Because, and it started in Dominaria really badly with the likes of Gideon and Jace. And it slowly moved on from there. And it really does seem like it seems like the company is moving away from what those stories were previously and trying to get rid of those canonically. Not necessarily fully retconning them, but kind of.
Yeah.
With the Jace Veraska one, like...
What it seems more like...
They're turning them into different characters, I feel like.
I think what they're doing is making all the characters shallow.
Yes, they're streamlining them so that they don't get to be that complex anymore, because these contract authors cannot keep up with the complexity of those characters.
Right.
They can't do it. And it's easier for the story team at Wizards as well, because then they don't have to keep track of the complexities of these characters and try to convey them to these new authors coming in who might have a quick turnaround time. And that's again...
I don't think there's a story team anymore.
Well, there is. I mean, again, we had that what's next in the Magic story that we got super pissed off at when they did it for Weekly MTG. And there were those 3 people, Nick Kelman and whoever the other 2 were, who were talking about all the great things that they wanted to do, and basically they wanted to be Marvel.
Yeah, and that's not a team. That's a couple of people.
It's 2 or 3 people that have figured out a way for the company to save money, to use their artists, or to use their authors the same way that they use their artists, contractually. But if you notice, it's not the same artists, or same authors over and over again like it's the same artists, because... otherwise, you run into a lot of the artist issues that we see. Notice how there aren't any authors being invited to Magic Fests or GPs, because then you run into the artist issue that they've been having recently, where artists are boycotting their events now because the artists are having to pay their own way to get to these Magic Fests.
Oh.
And then they have to bring their own product and set their own pricing, and some Magic players think that they shouldn't have to pay to get a card signed by the artist, or buy a print, or I guess buy a print is one thing, but they feel that they should be able to bring a card to the artist and have the artist sign it and they get to walk away. Well, that's great, but if the artist had to pay for a flight there and had to pay for their own table space and etc.,
Yeah.
how are they supposed to make that money back? And sure, that's not you, the consumer and or fan's fault, but realize where they're coming from, and like I said, that a group of them are joining together and signing boycotts to your events because you're not treating them correctly, because you have them as contract workers, not as in-house staff. Like you originally had your writing team and then fired them all, one by one by one by one, and or shifted them to different areas of the company. And made it like that was okay.
Yeah.
And again...
And then you sat there and gloated about it. You sat there and said, look at this new stuff we're doing. It's so great. No, it's literally the worst.
Well...
You suck.
Well, and we're in it now. We're seeing everything that has fallen apart.
Right.
In the way that it has fallen apart. The comic book, the Chandra comic, how many times was that kicked back or pushed back? The release date on it?
Has that even ever come out?
2, I believe, have. Maybe 3.
Because I, at one point, really wanted to look at that, but at this point, I don't even think I care anymore.
Yeah, a couple of them have been released. They also supposedly were from, after War of the Spark, I think that's what they were saying. And so if that's the case, then the Chandra comic comes out before War of the Spark, even though it depicts events from after War of the Spark, this being the novel. Then the novel comes out talking about information that you were supposed to know from the prequel stories, which have not come out yet at the time that the novel was out. Then the prequel stories start coming out, and then we get information for the sequel story. So there is literally not anything that has come out in any type of sequential order at all. Nothing. There are no 2 things that have come out one after the other that are actually in that sequence timeline-wise. Not a single thing out of the 4 things that came out. Because they did the Chandra sequel first, then the novel, which was a sequel to the prequel, which then came out, and then the sequel to the novel comes out after that. There is no consistency at all, but again, it's as Amy said. It's too many cooks, it's your hand in too many pots, and it's your left hand not knowing what your right hand's doing because you are working with Random House and you're independent authors and you're doing online fiction, but you're also doing novels, and you're doing a second novel, and you're doing a comic book with IDW, and you're doing this, and you're doing that, and it seems like...
A cluster.
It seems like every last one of them is getting screwed up. And you know what? There may be one or two that aren't, but it's impossible to tell the difference anymore because that's all that's happening, is that everything, it feels like everything is getting so screwed up. And this novel, since we're reviewing the novel here, this novel was so poorly received.
Yes.
To the point where the professor put out his review of the novel and rightfully trashed it. I don't agree with everything that he said, but I don't necessarily think that some of the things were I don't necessarily think that the things were unfair.
Right.
I think that they're fair points and he's absolutely entitled to his opinion. I disagree, we disagree with some of the things that he said, but I'm sure if he watched these, he would disagree with some of the things that we said. That's just how life works. That's perfectly fine because human beings can disagree, and we always offer for you guys to leave contrary opinions in the comments to anything and everything because we want to hear other sides.
Yeah.
Because if we both agree on something and are convinced that that's the way it is, someone else telling us something different can open our eyes, and or we can look at that and go, it's an interesting point. I still believe what I believe, but it's an interesting point. Or we can look at it and go, you know what? That's a really good way of looking at it. I hadn't thought of it that way. You get to open your eyes to other possibilities. But the professor, with his large reach, was able to say, these are my opinions. And if you go into the comments section of his video, there are a lot of people who said things like, wow, I knew going in that this was going to be bad, so glad I didn't spend my money on it. He's entitled to his opinion, folks. He has a large outreach, and he has every right to say that he thought the book was bad. Because of that, there are potential customers who did not purchase that book.
Right.
That's fair. Reviews are a thing. We're doing a review now.
Right.
I would not think maybe that you would come to our review before deciding whether or not to purchase the book, mainly because it took us so long to review it, but also because, I mean, I guess we do the short reviews in the beginning to say, we thought it was worth it, go pick it up.
Right. But at least when it's our other videos, that is a free story that we're telling you not to waste your time reading.
Right. Or definitely go, it's amazing, go read
right.
it.
It's not you spending money or not spending money, right?
Yeah.
So that was us telling you, don't bother reading that, just skip to the next one or something like that.
And or watch our review and whatever.
Knowing that Wizards of the Coast isn't losing money just because you're skipping that one story.
Right.
Whereas for this, his bad review of that book lost them a lot of potential money.
Which is not necessarily undeserved.
Right.
Right, that's, again, we've said this in the past in other videos, we're not attempting in any way to trash our fellow content creators. This is the reference that we're making because he is the largest creator on this platform and has a large reach, and that reach has influence as well. I mean, the professor is very well known for doing reviews of secondary products like sleeves, deck boxes, etc., and people, I'm sure, absolutely cater their spending habits to his reviews. And that should not necessarily be overlooked with regard to this novel. Going on to Reddit recently, because War of the Spark, the sequel book now has a title, War of the Spark Forsaken, and even more recently it has a cover photo, or cover art, again by Magali Villeneuve, which, I mean, this is great, right? That's just awesome. I really enjoyed that, and the new art, in my opinion, doesn't disappoint. I enjoyed it as well. Yes. For Forsaken, but the Reddit post about that new art, the art showed that it said by Greg Weisman. You better believe there were people in the comments who were like, nope, no thanks, not another one, absolutely not. And that's presumably, at least from what they were saying, because, you're allowed to not write things that are real on the internet, but based on what they said, those were people who bought the first book.
Right.
This book that we're reviewing now, and said, yep, I purchased it, I read it, you're not getting me to do it again. Well, guess what? We don't know at this point what the future of the Magic story holds after that sequel novel comes out in November. Are they going to do more novels? Are they going to do more online stories? Are they going to do straight nothing at all?
Do they even know what they're doing?
Hopefully now they do, because they do
Hopefully
go like
by now.
they do go like, you know, a year or two in advance. So
But they used to. I mean, there's no telling what
no, they
do
do.
now.
They definitely do.
Because
They still do that. I
it's
know.
not like they kept to any of the timelines that they had tried to keep to originally with any of this stuff.
Well,
content.
that's release content. This is prepping ahead of time.
Yes, but release is dependent on the prep.
True.
So if you're starting the prep later than you were planning on starting the prep, that's why you end up with deadlines that keep getting pushed out.
That's true. And but again, it leads to another issue that we've discussed on this channel, and we encourage you to go back and look at it, is communication.
Yeah.
We've talked about it before. We talked about it with the Vivian Reed stories. There wasn't any. Spoilers, there wasn't any.
You're right.
That's the problem. If you're not talking to your fan base, I'm going to be able to sit here and say, it seems like you don't know what the hell you're doing.
Right.
Because the evidence shows that you don't know what the hell you're doing. But if you're not telling us that you know what the hell you're doing, then it doesn't seem like you know what the hell you're doing. The information is so all over the place, and you have much more prominent people than us who are calling you out publicly for your garbage decision making. And you have to push Doug Beyer out. We talked about this. Push Doug Beyer out in front of everybody and go, yeah, guys, the prequel stories are coming out after the novel, and then the sequel stories are coming out. We're sorry that it worked in that order, but it had to. And then his tweet was responded to by 1 million people. But why? Nothing. That's just how it had to happen, apparently. But it just makes you look, as the word that Amy used, pathetic.
Pathetic, disorganized.
And so...
Unprofessional.
So I have 2 questions to close out this video. Questions for you, questions for me, and questions for you all as well. First of all, Amy, yes or no question, but please expound on it. It's our show after all. Was, in your opinion, from your reading of this story, was Greg Weisman the right choice to write this novel?
I don't know that you can make a determination like that, because this novel debatably shouldn't have been this novel.
Okay, so
so maybe you can say, okay, the reason for that is the author. But if there's so many different sort of competing things that could have been the reason why this novel shouldn't have been this novel, then you can't say, well, this shouldn't have been the author, because then it being a different author might not have fixed even one of those issues.
So I don't have a pen over here on my notes. My second question was going to be, can you read that?
Was it his fault?
Hey, guess what? I think you answered my question. Because I agree with you. My initial reaction is to say, he did a bad job.
But we don't know that.
Correct.
Maybe what he was asked to do was this pile of nonsense.
Correct. And you know what sucks? Going into this venture that Wizards did of having authors on contract with you to write your stories was supposed to have been, at least from my estimation, we discussed this in our previous JaARs around that time as well, it seems to have been an attempt at a symbiotic relationship. The author would bring their fan base to Magic the Gathering stories. And to say, hey, I'm writing stories for Magic the Gathering. Did you know Magic the Gathering had stories? If you like the work that I do, check it out. Here's their website link. This is where I put up the stories. Or every week, tweeting out, my new story just came out, here it is.
And that makes sense if it's a YouTube video, but it doesn't make sense for Magic the Gathering story content.
Well, for an article, right? It was an article on the website. So like when Martha Wells did it for Dominaria. She would say, here's the new Dominaria story that came out this week.
I understand, but...
And so her fans would get to go see that story.
Yeah, her fans would go, look at that, go, what the heck is this, and then leave.
Maybe. Again, what I'm saying is, in an ideal world, Magical Christmas Land, if you want to call it that,
Wow.
that's fine. I don't think it's that difficult of a hurdle, personally, but I think that's the ideal scenario that they were going for with this venture. And on the opposite side, since I didn't get there yet, on the opposite side, you have Magic fans who will read a Greg Weisman story and say, I want to go see what else he's written. Obviously, bad example because we just talked about whether or not this bad book was his fault.
Right.
Again, that's not really necessarily fair. Some people's
We
opinions
liked
that it was
this
yes.
book.
Some people's opinions that it was a bad book. Was that his fault? And does that mean that all of Greg Weisman's written work is as bad as people think this is? But for people like Nikki Drayden, Kate Elliott, right? People who wrote stories that we all enjoyed, did that gain them more fans from the Magic community? I think it did.
Maybe.
I think
But what would be great is if they also wrote this book.
Well-
and also are going to write the sequel stories and also are going to write stories in the future for other sets.
Well, and
instead of using a different author every single time, so you don't have the resources to prepare them and you don't have an adequate representation of their skills in performing what it is you're asking them to do, and you don't have the fan base in us continuing to go back to them each time, because we remember Nikki Drayden's name because we know we like her. Greg Weisman, we might remember his name because
it'll live in infamy.
right, yeah. And that's not how you want to remember someone's name.
It's
But
not.
there are also stories that I'm sure we've forgotten the artists or the writers' names because they weren't that spectacular. And so maybe we never hear from them again, but maybe we never hear from Nikki Drayden again either. And that would suck because she was great. And it would really be great if they tried to do actually what they do with the artists, which is use the same ones over and over and over. Maybe they only do 1 or 2 works for a set, but then the next set or 2 sets later or 3 sets later, they're doing it again. And that's something that would make sense for them to do. If you're going to use contract workers, contract the people time and time again that you know do a good job. That's how they learn enough about Magic the Gathering to actually keep the continuity, and that's how we stick around for those stories each time because we know the authors are going to be good.
I agree and disagree with what you just said.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. Artists, there's a reason why, in my estimation, there's a reason why having authors be picked and utilized in the same way as your artists is wrong. And that's because you should have one author per set. You should. That doesn't mean that it has to be a different author from set to set. We saw Nikki Drayden do Guilds of Ravnica and Ravnica Allegiance. But for each set, there are 200 plus pieces of art that need to be drawn. Because there are 200 something cards per set. Mm-hmm. You can't have an artist do 200 individual drawings every 3 months. Or if you do, they're going to look real bad. So you have a lot of different artists collaborating together and working on the world book and the setting guide and etc. You have those artists that come in for, I'm not going to remember the name of the step that Wizards uses, but they have a couple of artists that they hire to come in and do the concept push, to do example arts, and then they send those out to say, hey, here's what the scenery around Ravnica looks like in the fall. Please be aware. And now here's your art description from your art director as to what they want in the art. But now you know what the background looks like or what the surrounding scenery should be, or etc. Having more than one author making different stories for the sets feels, in my opinion, like a little bit of a cluster that you're asking for. Because if you're talking about...
saying.
Okay.
I'm saying you use the same author for the same set.
Right.
But you use them again.
Right, but then you only have like 5 or 6. How off? What do you mean again? You said a few sets later. There's 4 sets a year. So you mean you use one author once a year, then you only have 4 authors.
Yeah, so...
That's not enough. In their estimation, it's clearly not.
Because to me that sounds great.
In their estimation, it's clearly not. And besides the fact that these authors...
Yes, in their estimation, it's clearly not, because they want to use a different author every single time, which is what makes this terrible.
Right, but they have to...
Time and time again.
Right, but they have to try these different authors out. Nikki Drayden is someone who absolutely deserves to come back again. After this, I'm sure they won't ask Greg Weisman back again. And again, we don't know whether that's Greg Weisman's fault or the story team's fault, but it doesn't matter. Because just like with the sequel novel, if they come out and they say, hey everyone, for this new set in 2021, the author for the Magic Stories is going to be Greg Weisman. You could hear a collective groan across the country when they announce that.
Yeah.
After this. And that's unfair to Greg,
right,
if it's not his fault that the stories are this way.
Even if it is, to a point, it's not. Like, even if it is his fault, to a point, it's not his fault. Because as I've said, there's no way to keep that continuity, to make it make sense, to actually do all of the things that they wanted him to accomplish in this novel without retconning some of the old stuff. There just wasn't a way to do it unless he wrote a 10,000 page novel. You know, and keep all the characters with lots of characterization and all of that, like, and the professor complained that the book was only a climax instead of a full story arc. If they included all of these things that were missing from this book, it would be the longest book in existence. It would be the worst thing to read. It would be worse than this book is.
Right, but don't forget, they have all the time in the world because they're the ones setting their own limits. So if you want to write the prequel stories for what's going on in Ravnica, as well as the prequel stories for all of your individual planeswalkers and what they're acting like coming into this fight, and then you want to write the climactic final battle, write 5 books.
Well, and that goes back to what you said before.
Because they're their own bosses.
The story team wants to be Marvel. So they're branching out into all these different media, and they're trying to do all these different things. What they should be doing is, if writing a novel, or pick your media, first of all, and what they should be doing is just making a lot of stories. Yeah. Instead of trying to cram it all into one story and having it make no sense, mm-hmm, and not be good. They should be, doing what Marvel did. Do 2 or 3 movies of this one character, so you fall in love with this one character. Do 2 or 3 movies of this one character, so you fall in love with this character. And then do 2 team-up movies, and then do another single movie, and then you can culminate these things into a movie. Because now people are watching this and going, these characters actually matter to me, and what they're doing matters. Instead of just being told, well, these characters need to matter because what they're doing needs to matter because I said so.
Oh, and speaking of jumping in different forms of media, don't forget the Netflix series. Which, by the way, so many people were like, oh my god, it's the Russo brothers, fresh off of Infinity War and Endgame, and they're going to do the magic stuff now. And it's like,
I had forgotten about that, to be honest with you.
But see, they don't want you to have forgotten about it, Amy, because that's, in my mind, that's clearly what they've been working towards. All of this other stuff fell by the wayside. But then they got to write the names the Russo brothers next to Magic the Gathering. Right. And they got to have whatever stupid article, whatever weird online news organization it was, that they got to write that article that they got to share proudly. Because that organization was the one that got that exclusive information. because Wizards is really trying to branch out so that Magic the Gathering is said everywhere. And it's like, sure.
Even Mix-a-Lot will know.
Right. Except that your player base won't know.
Right.
Because you won't talk to them about it.
The YouTube content creators who depend on this stuff every single week to give them content to produce for their YouTube channels won't know.
Oh, I wasn't even going to talk about that. I mean, there's podcasts as well, and etc. Regardless,
I'm just saying.
I'm going to stop us here. All I am going to say in closing is we will be purchasing. In fact, we have already pre-ordered War of the Spark Forsaken.
Yes.
Because we liked this story as a whole.
Not that you would get that from this video. I apologize.
Once you delve into it and look at it in particular, you're going to get this kind of a reaction from people who know the content very well.
Right.
I would love to say, and I make no promises, but I would love to say that I'm trying right now to put my money where my mouth is in terms of when I say that I think that this novel was written for new readers. Stay tuned. New readers to the Magic story. Stay tuned. I'm trying. I don't want to spoil anything because if it falls through, then I don't look like an ass. But if it doesn't fall through, I think you're really going to enjoy something that we have coming. It's going to be a ways off. So definitely stay tuned to the channel for that. But what I will say in terms of War of the Spark Forsaken, we did pre-order it. We will be getting it.
Yes.
We will be reading it. We will be reviewing it.
Yes.
And from the look of the cover art, it looks like, first of all, we got a depiction, what looks like a depiction of Rat, which is cool. We hadn't seen that yet. And that's only an assumption, but it's a pretty strong assumption. It's Teo, Kaya, and a third person, a younger female, who looks like she's dressed in Gruul garb, so who the heck else would it be?
Right, and is not anyone we know yet.
Right, seemingly. Unless it's a very de-aged Arlen Cord. But yeah, so that book is coming out, but if the cover is to be believed, we're looking at a Teo, Kaya, Rat-based story, and Liliana was up at the top, but it looks like it's those three. And if that's the case, I think that was some of the best. I mean,
Yes.
I talked about Teo last week. We talked about Teo and Rat last week. Go check out last week's video if you want some actual positivity. I'm somewhat optimistic. There is still some hope.
Actual character interaction.
Yes, there's some hope inside of me for what that novel could be, and one way or the other, we will find out about that when it finally comes out in November.
Ugh. Grapes.
And it's like the second week of November, or maybe it's November 4th or something. It does have a definitive date, I just don't remember it off the top of my head. But they did actually tell us when it's going to be, again, like I said, because they're asking you to prepay for it, so they have to tell you when they're shipping it to you. But that does not mean that you will not be getting a JaAR next week. The prequel stories are out, and not all of them, but the first like 5 or so are out already. So we're going to be reading some. We'll break it up as best we can. I don't know that we're going to... I guess we'll have to check the calendar and see how many weeks are between now and November.
Oh, jeez. Too many.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. So we may do a chapter per week, because those chapters are kind of long. From what I've seen.
Okay.
So we may do a chapter a week, we may not. If you have very strong opinions one way or the other, leave them in the comments. That's what the comments are for. Your strong opinions one way or the other. And honestly, we talked a lot, and I feel like this is one of the longest JaARs we've ever done. I can't see the timer on the camera over there, but I will find out when we walk over there. But it feels like it's the longest JaAR we've ever done. So, if you have hung out with us from the beginning to the end of this one video, with all of our novel review videos, if you are just watching the end of this one for some reason, why just skip to the end? It's not a pack opening. I'm not going to show you the cool cards I got. But hey, no matter what you did, thank you so much for joining us on this crazy journey of going through this novel that we thought was good, but then kind of ended up trashing it the whole time, I feel like.
Yeah.
But I think it's because to
we like the
review
novel, it's just
overall, and the part that we liked, it takes like 20 seconds to explain why we liked it, and then all the parts, the minutia that we didn't like, takes a long time to talk about why we didn't. So thank you for joining us on this crazy journey that we just went on. If you have opinions, if you agree with us, if you disagree with us, if you want to talk about War of the Spark Forsaken, if you want to talk about the prequel stories, whatever you want to talk about, that's what the comments are for. Yes. We would love for you to join in the discussion with us and your fellow viewers down below, your fellow Vorthos, in showing off your...
#Vorthos Pride.
We're done. We did the novel, guys. So, from the Geek for All YouTube channel, I have been Joe.
And I'm Amy.
We will see you in all the other crazy things we have coming up soon. And as we always say, in whichever video of ours you watch next, we will see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.